What's interesting every time I teach these classes is I get the chance, I learn much more teaching the class than I do preparing for the class. Because as I hear myself talk and then spend the following week thinking about what I said, sometimes I'm disappointed in the way I explain things. Sometimes a source or a comment that somebody made really sticks with me. So that happened to me this week with the source that we went over from Mishnah Eduyot last week. And I want to go back to it and provide more context and have a bit more maybe discussion or interaction with you about what is motivating, particularly the comment of Rabbi Yehoshua in the Mishnah. Because I think we went over it too quickly. And I paid too much attention to the words and not enough attention to what's behind the words. So let me give you a better introduction to this Mishnah. I'm not happy with the way I presented it. And I apologize for wasting your time and forcing us to go over this again. What is the story, maybe the most famous story of Rabbinic Judaism about how Judaism was preserved following the destruction of the temple? The story involves, I usually tell the story once in every few years around Lag BaOmer, because it involves Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. You know the story? Jerusalem is burning. The temple's been destroyed. And do you remember that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was smuggled out of the burning city in a coffin as the city was being besieged? And there were two students of his who carried him out in that coffin. It was Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer. They're often quoted together, Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer. They are two of the 5 students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai who re-establish Judaism or give Judaism a new headquarters in, anyone remember where? Yavne, right? And the fable is that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai predicts that the Roman general responsible for the conquering of Jerusalem, I forget who, Nero or Vespasian, or I can you Google that for me?
I think it's Vespasian.
Okay, Vespasian, thank you. Predicts that Vespasian will become the new emperor, which does happen, and as a reward for this very, this very peculiar, almost prophetic prediction about Vespasian's life, he was given Yavne and the opportunity to really build the Mishnah as we have it. And the Mishnah is the result of debates and discussions in the schools of Yavne, which is in the Galilee. And the traditions were all written down, right? And that's really what the Mishnah is. It's an organized record of the discussion and debates and recollections that come from that era after the destruction of the temple. So the 5 students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, they are the ones who really keep the tradition alive during that time. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hyrcanus is one of them. So I didn't give you that perspective, and I think that perspective is important because you're dealing with two people, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, who saw with their own eyes the temple destroyed. Now let's reread the source and understand their two comments and maybe think a little bit deeper about them, about why they're talking about this. The Mishnah is a book of law. So and the temple's destroyed by the time that these statements are being made. So why are they talking about it? And what might be the deeper reflection or understanding behind the words? Rabbi Eliezer says, I heard a tradition. You remember this verse? I heard a tradition. Sorry, I said Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hyrcanus. It's Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania. That was his father. So first, Rabbi Eliezer. Remember, Rabbi Eliezer's comment is he's talking about how they built the temple. And what was his insight? That the way they built the Holy of Holies was from the outside in. That is, he's saying, well, many, many, many years ago, when the Holy of Holies was built, in other words, before there was a structure standing there. I don't know whether he's talking about the first or the second temple, but he's talking about many centuries before. Before there was a structure standing there, the workmen knew they were not to go into that place. I'm sorry, I said something wrong. He is talking about the second temple, because that was after the first temple was the temple that consecrated that space. When Solomon, we saw those verses in the first class, consecrated that space above the Temple Mount. And he says the workmen knew that there was a space there on the Temple Mount into which they could not enter. And therefore, how do you build a house when you can't go in the house? Well, you would build it from the outside in, right? They wouldn't go in to the sacred space. Remember, the only one who's allowed to go in there is the high priest on the Holy of Holies. Okay, that's Rabbi Eliezer's statement. Rabbi Yehoshua, and these guys usually disagree, but I don't think here they're disagreeing. Rabbi Yehoshua says, and I heard that sacrifices can be offered on the Temple Mount, even in the absence of a temple. So do you see why I say I don't think they disagree? They're both saying the fact that there is or is not a structure there, the fact that it is whether it is being used or not used, ours or not ours, is irrelevant. When we go up there, there is a spot, a site that is sanctified, and it remains holy. The proof that Rabbi Eliezer uses is it was holy when we rebuilt the second temple, and there was no temple standing there yet, but we knew that it was a holy space. And Rabbi Yehoshua says, not only that, now that it's been destroyed, we could even go up there and make sacrifices, because it is not the building or the presence of people that makes it holy. It is as we read right at the end, Kedusha Rishona, Kedsha L'Sha'ata, V'Kedsha L'Atid Lavo. It is permanently sacred, forever and ever. So before we move on to the next question that we were going to explore, which is the exclusivity question. So is that the only site that could be sanctified in such a way? Could we have a temple also somewhere else? Let's first try and think about Rabbi Yehoshua and where this is coming from. why do you think that both Tanaim are the rabbis of the Mishnah, of the Mishnaic era? Why do you think they are recorded having this discussion and make this statement? These are rabbis who saw the temple burning and who both say, we could go back up there right now and make, if we could, we wouldn't be killed for doing so, we could go back up there right now and make sacrifices. And if we were to rebuild the temple again, presumably we would still have to build it from the outside in and not from the inside out. What is motivating? What is the theology behind those statements? I don't want to move forward unless we think about that. Does anyone have any thoughts?
Still a holy place, and we can build another temple there.
And why do they care? Why does it matter to them that we say that it is still a holy place and we could build another temple? I mean, it's not even, I don't want to go to, we can build another temple there. They don't get there. But they say the first thing you say, still a holy place.
I think
we don't even need a temple. We don't need a temple there. We could just we could just put an altar there. And even if we don't have an altar, we still could do Meiser there, right? All the other rituals that required presence on the Temple Mount. We read last week the importance of having a site for everyone to gather. We could still do it. What is the statement or the theology behind the words?
Well, maybe it's not only, maybe not theology, but maybe psychological impact.
Just one sec, Rosa. I'll get to you right after Rona. Yes?
The preservation of the Jewish people, they have to have some form that they can come together.
I like that comment a lot. Yes. And Rose, what were you saying?
I would say maybe there's also a psychological impact on the rest of the people. And if you say you can still pray and you could still do it, it gives that optimism and that hope that this is theologically still.
Those are great comments. I hope thank you, Rose, that I hope everyone heard. And I think very similar what Rona and Rose were saying. Yes, Rose was saying it gives people a sense of optimism and hope that it's not all lost, a sense that there's a future. I agree with that. I mean, I'm trying to read the sentiments behind the words, just to play with this a little bit and to give us a deeper understanding. Imagine if they had said something different. If Rabbi Yeshua said, this place, which was sanctified once a long time ago, is now nothing to us. It has been decommissioned. The building is no longer there. Therefore, God's presence is no longer. Start from scratch all over again. If they had made a statement like that, what would Judaism have looked like? What would the people have felt? What would the scholars have felt? And I think these are the questions we should be thinking about when we read these sources. That the tradition of maintaining the holiness of the Temple Mount comes from somewhere very profound in Jewish historical memory. Remember the famous line from Professor Yerushalmi, that history is different than memory, right? History is what happened on what day. Memory is emotional. Memory is powerful. Memory shapes people. This is, I think, a statement that deserves attention because of its appeal to Jewish memory. The Bible might be seen as a book that begins with the creation of the world and ends with the establishment of a sanctuary. it's almost like the goal. In Jewish theology, and we see this in the cycle of holidays, right? The cycle of Jewish holidays. Pesach, freedom. Shavuot, the receiving of the law. And then the last holiday of the year, Sukkot. What is a sukkah, right? It's building an abode, having a dwelling place. And the affirmation by Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer that that dwelling place is still there. They did not take that from us. I think as much as it is an appeal to the people to remain hopeful, as Rose said, and optimistic, and this is still ours, and it's not just still ours, it's still there. The temple is still there. Don't believe what your eyes saw. Your eyes saw a building burning, but that wasn't the temple. The temple is something bigger. It's not a building. It's a place sanctified for all time. No one can ever take it from us. Is also almost an act of resistance against the Romans. You didn't take away our holy site. You just took away the building that was there, but that was never important. We lost it before then we built it again as soon as we got the chance. But it will be holy forever. Yes, couple of comments. Roz?
History and the memory, because the history is in a definite place. And memory can be subjective. I mean, you don't always remember things the way they were.
But I think that is the point. So the question is about history and memory, and don't we need the history? I think we do need both, but for the rabbis, when facing a traumatic loss, and that's what this is. These are rabbis, and I failed to mention that. I'm embarrassed that I didn't mention that. We went over the source. You have to see this as coming from people deeply traumatized and terrified that now that the temple's destroyed, Judaism will be over, kaput. So they have the history. They know what happened. But the way they're going to frame it is going to make all the difference. They know the temple's no longer there, but if they choose to ascribe to that event too much significance, it could spell the end of Judaism. God's presence is now gone elsewhere. And for Christians, this was the claim. The claim was that the I'm not saying that they were influenced, it could be. It's still very early for Christian influence, but there are scholars who say that even as early as the 2nd century, which is when this is written, they are aware of how the Christians interpret the destruction of the temple. And for Christians, it is nothing less than the removal of divine sanction, the removal of divine blessing. It is the decommissioning. That's why the Temple Mount is not holy to Christians, despite the fact that the New Testament has all sorts of stories about Jesus on the Temple Mount. It was clearly a holy site to him. But if you want to see where the Christians are, they're at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They're in a different building. That's their holy place. They're on the Via Dolorosa, because the Christian interpretation is that was a Jewish site. They rejected the Jewish Messiah, and God said, I'm out of here. Right? So memory becomes much more important. And that's what they're doing, the rabbis. They're shaping their history through memory. And say, no, you Christians, you're wrong. God is still there. In fact, we could do sacrifices up there now and forever because it was permanent. And the Jewish claim was always, that's why we don't have a New Testament. The rabbinic claim is it was all preordained from the beginning. And there are some things that are permanent, like the Jewish people. It's permanent. The Christians said, no, it's not. God changed his mind. Jewish people aren't his people anymore. No, it's permanent. And the Temple Mount, it is permanent. See the difference, Marlene?
If the rabbis had not acclaimed the permanence of the holy site, it actually would have spoken to God being not omnipotent or being omnipresent. And in that case, I mean, everybody would have gone their own way and it may not have been a Judaism as we know it today. I mean, we still say that that is a holy site.
Right.
All of these years later. So from a theological point of view, it would have weakened the presence of God in the eyes of the people.
It would have weakened the presence of God, although I think we're going to learn about, we have yet to learn about, well, whether God can be manifest elsewhere, right?
Well, we know
But the fact that God was manifest in a particular time, in a particular place, and that other people were saying, ha ha, he's not anymore. And what's the proof? It's gone. We won. The act of resistance that you can't, there are some things you can never take from us. I think here we would be foolish to miss, even though I don't have proof for anything I'm saying. This is all just conjecture, but I hope I'm convincing some of you that there is something more powerful here than just the words being uttered. That I think, to jump to today, is still crucial for understanding why the Temple Mount remains a place of pilgrimage and holiness, even for us. We are drawing a connection that very few peoples in the world can do. Who else can say, I'm at a site that was sacred 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, that I can be there? I mean, my kids, we went there last year, and they have a 3D sort of show where they put 3D goggles on you and they show you like what the temple looked like. And they didn't have that when I was a kid, but they have it now. And my kids were watching that movie, and it's all right there in front of you, and you can really imagine right there on that site. So the stories you're reading in the Bible and the idea of God having a sanctuary, it's not a fairy tale. So the rabbis, I think, in the oral tradition, preserve the rituals of the temple. As you know, the Mishnah does not skip over the temple rituals, which you think it might do. We're talking, the Mishnah was edited in the year 200. The temple was destroyed in the year 70. 130 years later, what are they wasting their time telling us which goat to bring for which sacrifice and what time to bring it at? We haven't done that in 120 years. But now you see why. It's because we are keeping the place alive. In our imagination, we're keeping the rituals alive. And even deeper, if we really could, we could go back there and offer these sacrifices and do these rituals again. We remain a holy people, tied to a holy land, and permanently fixated on a holy place. Not a holy building or a holy service, but a holy building. But a holy site. But a holy site, which keeps us alive and optimistic and connected to our heritage. That is our memory, and that can never be taken from us.
So, Rabbi,
Right?
Rabbi.
Now
yeah.
this, Rose.
Sorry. Rabbi Sachs speaks a lot to that. He speaks to history as
Isn't his yard site today or yesterday?
Yes, it was. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Rabbi
But
Jonathan Sachs, his yard site was yesterday. Or today.
I think, yeah. He speaks a lot to his history. He says that history is something, it's an event that happened. Memory personalizes to us, and we are a people of memory. And that's what brings us together.
Great. Yes. And I know what you're referring to. And even he quotes Yerushalmi because he knows Professor Chaim Yosef Yerushalmi was the one who created that concept, and he reasserted it, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, right? That Jews work with memory, not with history. It's historians and science job to tell you what happened on what day. But it's a rabbinic job to frame it. And that is what you are seeing here. It's not just some tradition that they once heard. You are looking at the first source, which frames the event, which you might call the most important event in Jewish history. I don't know. I'll take that back. It's not the most event, but top 10. Definitely the biggest tragedy in Jewish history. Let's change it that. Which frames the greatest tragedy in Jewish history before the Holocaust. Which frames it using memory. Right? Why are we tied to that place today? Why can't we move it? Because the oral tradition was not going to give in, perhaps, to being defeated. We would not give in to replacement theology or the decommissioning theology, that there's a new place and a new people, and God left the Jews, and the Romans took it from us. It's still ours. Are we ready to move on, or any other comments? Okay, I hope you agree with me that it deserved a little bit of extra attention, that source, especially because, remember what I said, there is no Tanaitic source, meaning no other source anywhere in the Mishnah that contradicts it. It's taken for granted. No one is going to argue with the rabbis who saw the destruction of the temple when they report that the event meant something, but it didn't mean everything. Right? It was important and significant, but it was not the kind of event that we ought to think of as cataclysmic, catastrophic, changing the course of Jewish history. It was a building they took from us, not a place. Okay. So, what's that? Roz, you had a question?
But the wall remains, I mean, it's a retaining wall, yet it has such holiness attached to it.
But it is not the wall that has the holiness. It's more the site itself, right? Okay, so to just review briefly what the rest of what we talked about last class, we talked about the question, or I introduced the question of whether, now that we've established that the site is eternally sacred, is it exclusively sacred? And I explained that we have biblical sources, very clear biblical sources, that attest to the presence of other sanctuaries and altars outside of Jerusalem. And I think this is an important question to consider, because so far I have given you a model of holiness of the Temple Mount, which seems to be totally inflexible. And there are consequences to that. When you think about the consequences of saying this spot was sanctified for all time, you're putting quite the boundary on any future negotiations. The world is can never progress to a place where the Jews would ever be comfortable with giving up any part of that site or leaving it. We will not stop till the end of days till we make sure that that site becomes one day a place with the restoration of something. I don't know whether it'll be sacrifices or some big synagogue, but it is the site itself, or it could just be nothing, right? Could just be, I don't know, we could just have dominion over it. But we will not rest until it's ours. So far, that's the picture I've painted. There may be, and that's what we're going to look at in the next couple of weeks, there may be, however, the option of reopening a practice that existed in the years before the temple was sanctified, and even while it was sanctified, the option of having other sites where temples could be built, other holy sites, right? And I explained to you that one of the ways that scholars understand the book of Deuteronomy is they see the repeated insistence that all of the rituals take place b'makom asher yivchar Hashem. All these must take place at the place where God chooses. And those words aren't found in earlier books of the Bible. So one of the ways that scholars understand the book of Deuteronomy is a book that insists on the centralization of worship in Jerusalem. And these words, which we saw at the end of chapter 12 in the book of Devarim, Hilovatem ad ata el haminucha ve'el hanachala asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha. Right now, we don't have that rule that sacrifices have to be offered exclusively in Jerusalem, because you have not yet come to the menucha and the nachala. We don't know what these words mean. The Talmud is going to try and understand what menucha and nachala mean. Jerusalem becomes a site of exclusive worship only when we have menucha and nachala, rest and inheritance. Let's look at the first source, Rabbi Shimon. Who gives us, I think, some insight on... Oh, I'm sorry. There's a source you don't have, because it would have driven you and me crazy. But if you want the source, it's the Talmud Bavli, Zvachin 119a.
Sorry, which page?
So the first source you don't have in your notes.
Oh, okay.
It's just easy for me to write it down.
Okay.
In the Talmud in Zvachin 119a, Rabbi Shimon I didn't give it to you because it's only 3 words that matter.
Oh, okay.
Says, Zu vezu Yerushalayim. Zu vezu Yerushalayim. How do I write that in English? Let's just say this and this equals Jerusalem. What is he talking about, zu vezu? He means menucha and nachala. On 119a, Rabbi Shimon says, when Devarim tells the people, you have not yet, you're allowed a free-for-all, you can make your altars anywhere you want, because you haven't yet gotten el hamenucha ve'el hanachala, to the rest and the inheritance, it may as well have said, you're allowed to do your sacrifices elsewhere because you have not yet gotten to Jerusalem, Jerusalem. So in Rabbi Shimon's view, to paraphrase it, Jerusalem has a unique status in Jewish history. It was the exclusive, meant to be the only exclusive shrine, the only place where you were permitted to sacrifice. Until Jerusalem was chosen by God, was a free-for-all. You could go wherever you want. Inheritance, we may have thought to mean the land, the whole land. Menucha might mean where God chose to rest his presence, right? And we know that God's presence in the Bible could be in many, many other places. But for Rabbi Shimon, none of that counts. Zu v'zu Yerushalayim. What does this tell us about the exclusivity of the shrine? We don't know what Rabbi Shimon would say after the temple is destroyed. But it seems to me that the likelihood is he would say there is no other place that could ever be offered as an alternative. According to the Torah, remember, and so he's interpreting words from the Torah. The Torah says the only place that sacrifices may be offered. Take a look at it on group number in, again, Devarim chapter 13, bottom of page 3. You shall not do so unto the Lord your God. I'm reading verse number 4. In other words, you can't sacrifice to the Lord your God, but unto the place which the Lord your God shall choose out to put his name there. So the Torah itself forbids, in Devarim, forbids sacrifices anywhere else but on the Temple Mount. And Rabbi Shimon says that was the only place that will ever have that status. Because you see, the Torah doesn't say Jerusalem. It just says the place that God's going to choose. But for Rabbi Shimon, the words Menucha and Nachala refer to Jerusalem and give it that exclusive status forever. That's the first opinion. Exclusivity without option for an alternative. Does this make everyone's with me?
Yeah.
Is this a flexible or inflexible reading of Jerusalem's holy status? Quite exclusive. Not only is God's presence there, not only will it never depart from there, God's presence will never go anywhere else. There will never be any other place where we could gather and focus together on as a people other than the Temple Mount in Yerushalayim. It there and only there. Now, if you take a look at the source on number 4, so this one is easier to read, that's why I gave it to you. You see an alternative view. When the Israelites came to Gilgal, it was permitted to sacrifice at regional altars. I'm on page 4. When they came to Shiloh, it was forbidden to sacrifice at regional altars. So this view in the Talmud says something a bit different. Gilgal and Shiloh are both before Jerusalem. Right? So turn back, you asked me about history. So let's turn back our mental clocks to before a temple stood. In the days and in the centuries following the conquest of the land by Joshua, there was no temple yet in Jerusalem. Who built the temple? Remind me? King Solomon, right? So that's the period of the kings. But we have to, there's the periods of the judges and the period of the prophets. Right? We don't have a temple yet. And the Talmud says, before the temple was built, it was permitted to sacrifice at regional altars. But then Shiloh was chosen, and it was forbidden to sacrifice there at any other regional altars. And it was a rest. It was a rest. It was a menucha. When they came to Nov and Givon, it was again permitted to sacrifice at regional altars. So look at what happens here. This is quite interesting. So God, what we're learning here is God's presence can be removed from a site. There is a decommissioning that can happen because Shiloh was like the temple in that it commanded an exclusive authority over the sacrifices. But then afterwards, when they came to Nov and Givon, in other words, the temple moved around. The shrine moved around. And this is after the decommissioning of Shiloh. And again, it was opened up. You could sacrifice wherever you want to. When they came to Jerusalem, the regional altars were forbidden and were never permitted again. That's important. And it was an inheritance. So, in Zvachim, this is Mishnah Zvachim. Menucha and Nachala are not Jerusalem. Menucha is what? But what city? Shiloh.
In Shiloh.
And Nachala
His inheritance
is Jerusalem. Go back to that verse if you need to be reminded. Ki ad ata lo higatem el hamenucha ve'el hanachala. Everything is going to change, says the Torah, when you get to the menucha and the nachala. For Rabbi Shimon, this is very simple. That means everything changes when you will build a temple in Jerusalem. When you build a temple in Jerusalem, that's when it will be forbidden to have sacrifices anywhere else. No regional altars or alternative temples are permitted. For the Mishnah in Zvachim, that is not the case. A little window opens, which might open even bigger windows. What does the Mishnah say? That actually this verse is about two different places which maintained sacred central status, one temporarily, one permanently. Shiloh had the claim. When Shiloh was established, it was an exclusive altar. But then it was decommissioned. Jerusalem was then, years later, established as the central site for worship, and it will never be decommissioned. It will always be a permanent site, right? The most sacred items could only be eaten inside the curtains, and lesser sacred items in Maser Sheni could only be eaten inside the wall, marking the perimeter of Jerusalem. Now, if you look again below in Mishnah Megillah, the same thing is stated. There is no difference between Shiloh and Jerusalem. These two cities, towns, had the same status, except that in Shiloh, lesser sacred items and Maser Sheni could be eaten anywhere in sight distance, whereas in Jerusalem, these must be eaten inside the walls. Small, irrelevant difference. Why? Because Jerusalem was a walled city, Shiloh was not. So since we know that Maser Sheni is the tithe, and the money from the tithe you have to buy in Jerusalem something. For those of you who are curious about Maser Sheni, you can Google it. Maser Sheni in Jerusalem, there were walls, so it was easy to buy whatever you needed in the walls. In Shiloh, the rule was a little different. It was not a walled city, so you had to have it in sight. As long as you could see Shiloh, you could buy something that was considered the greater Shiloh area, the GSA. But look what the Mishnah says now. But the sanctity of Shiloh was released, whereas the sanctity of Jerusalem is never released. Kedushat Shiloh yesh achareya heter, ukedushat Yerushalayim ein achareha heter. If you notice, okay, so I'm slowly opening up a window that suggests that the idea of a holy space that can be decommissioned has precedence in Judaism. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, it's irrelevant because Jerusalem, it says in all these sources, can never be decommissioned. So what are we wasting our time with? Okay, fine.
Can I ask a question?
But just one sec, Rose.
Okay.
Decommission Jerusalem. Well, other places can be decommissioned. And we know that it in fact happened in Shiloh, which was a very holy site. And if it can happen there, then we can remove its sanctity. Yesh achareya heter. Then maybe other sites we could do the same for. I know Jerusalem still has its status, but I'm making things a little more flexible before I'm about to make things very flexible. Yes, Rose, go ahead.
I just want to ask a question. We entered Israel with the Mishkan, and it's all about the Mishkan. So is the Mishkan first in Gilgal because that's our first stop, and then it goes to Shiloh, and then we go to Jerusalem?
Oh, you're asking, that is a tough question. So Rose's question is, where was the journey of the shrine as it passed through? The reality probably, Rose, is that there was no single shrine.
Oh.
Right?
Okay.
And we know this because the prophets get very angry about it. There were multiple shrines in different regions, and that this was okay.
Okay.
Right? And that Shiloh, it's not clear whether Shiloh was ever the exclusive shrine. What could have happened at Shiloh is that was the place where the 10 Commandments, let's say, were kept, or the Ark of the Covenant was kept. But just because the Ark of the Covenant was there, it doesn't mean that there were not other altars just as sacred and holy, but where the Ark of the Covenant was not kept, right? And if you remember the famous story of the Ark being carried to Jerusalem, do you remember that story? Oh man, I'm not prepared for this, but you know that because I wish I had the reference for you. I'm not good with that stuff and the names of everybody. Do you remember the story of the Ark being carried to Jerusalem and something? Can you Google this for me, Daniel? Touches the Ark and dies on its way. So there's a difference between a shrine and the Ark of the Covenant. the Ark of the Covenant, we learned from that story, was moved from place to place until it finally made its way. You know the Ark of the Covenant, right? But the angels are across it. So it moved from place to place. But it's not clear that that Ark of the Covenant needed to be present in order for sacrifices to be offered. Right? Do you have the story? Where's it from?
Bringing the ark to Abinadab.
He was the one who touched it. Avinadav was the one who touched it and died.
Oh,
Okay, Daniel's gonna get the story. He's human Google.
it was not. Is it Nakon Uzzah reached out?
Uzzah, thank you. Uzzah reached out to touch the ark and
Struck him down and he died.
Right.
Beside the ark.
right. Uzzah, and what's the book of the Bible? Samuel.
Yeah, from 2 Samuel.
2 Samuel, chapter 6. You want to pull it up? Pull up the story. I mean, I'm only citing it to show you that before there was a menucha and a nachala, it was almost like a nomadic thing that the ark would go around from place to place. And it might have rested in Shiloh or somewhere else for a long time. But again, it doesn't mean that there were not regional altars in many different places. We know that there were. And the biblical sources are explicit about that. And they get angry, the prophets, because of it. And want centralization of worship because in the end, to have everybody in one place, under one authority, under one system is a much better nation-building strategy than having regional altars everywhere, which tends to bring about competition and more, let's say, a more dislocated Jewish people. Okay? Let's open this up, though, a little bit wider. I want to look at Bavli Megillah 10a. Do you have that source here? Oh, yes, you do. The question is whether
That's it, page 6.
No, I have it on page 6. Yeah, page 6 at the bottom and 7. Let's just do page 6. We don't have to, but I'm afraid to tackle the source on page 7 because I might need a whole class. Everyone sees that on page 7? I don't know if we have enough time to go over it. So it's a monster. Let's just look at page 6. Zvachim 119a. Zvachim 119a. Oh, here we go. I did give you guys this source. Okay. It is taught, you have not yet come to the rest and to the inheritance. To the rest. This refers to Shiloh. To the inheritance, this refers to Jerusalem. Why were they referred to separately? To indicate that there is a release between the two of them. Between the eras of Shiloh and Jerusalem, it was permitted to sacrifice at regional altars. Everyone understands that? The period between the two was a period that allowed for more altars to be established. Now, what years was it? I would say the period of the kings, you want to know CE, the periods of the kings about 1,000 BC. Yeah. I would say somewhere between the 13th and the 10th century BC. Imprecisely. There was a release in those years. And by the way, you can see how this is going to open the doorway to saying, well, if the regional altars were allowed when the temple in Shiloh was gone, so why can't we have other altars when the temple in Jerusalem is gone? Right? If the whole idea is you have to continue the sacrificial system, or you have to have that single site of gathering, shouldn't we be working to get back towards there? A teaching from the school of Rabbi Ishmael, both terms refer to Shiloh. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, here you go, Zu v'Zu Yerushalayim. Sorry, I didn't see that I included that. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai Omer Zu v'Zu Yerushalayim. What is the difference of opinion? Well, now you understand it, right? For Rabbi Shimon, there was only one place that commanded ever in Jewish history exclusive power over Jewish worship, and it was Zu v'Zu Yerushalayim, the temple. For the Mishnah in Zvachim and the earlier sources in the Talmud Bavli that you have presented before you, rest and inheritance mean Shiloh and Jerusalem. There were two sites that commanded exclusivity. One temporary, one permanently. Now, what about this interesting teaching from Rabbi Ishmael? Both terms, rest and inheritance, refer to Shiloh. Let's look at what Rashi says on that below. Everyone knows what who Rashi is. Rashi interprets the Talmud.
He's a
Both
Pashtan.
terms, rest and inheritance, refer to Shiloh. That's what the Talmud says. So think for a moment about the implication here. That when God says, I want there to be one site where you offer anything, where you offer all your sacrifices, God is not talking about Jerusalem. God's talking about Shiloh, which nonetheless has a permitted period of regional sacrifice that follows its dominance. So Rashi pulls back here from Rabbi Ishmael's statement. Rabbi Ishmael, you might think, is suggesting that Jerusalem was never even thought about in the Bible. It was really Shiloh that God was referring to. And only once Shiloh was established, did it have exclusivity. But nowhere else had exclusivity. But look what Rashi says. After Shiloh was, Rashi's job is to smooth out the text. So he's smoothing things out. After it dominated, there was a period of free sacrifice. After Shiloh, and we don't know when it stopped being dominated, but at some point it lost its status. And then other places were opened up for offerings. This view holds that the initial sanctity of Jerusalem was sacred for its own time, but not forever after. And this view holds that even the sanctity of Jerusalem is followed by a period of release. Whoa. Okay. Now have something else. You can say this is the view of Rabbi Ishmael. So I'll write it really small here. But that's what I'm writing, even though you can't read it. Okay, why am I freaked out by this comment? This view holds. So Rabbi Shimon, this and this is Jerusalem. Rabbi Ishmael, this and this is Shiloh. Rashi explains Rabbi Ishmael's point of view. Rabbi Ishmael thought that Shiloh had that right to exclusivity over Jewish worship while it stood. After it was decommissioned, regional altars were again permitted. And then Jerusalem could also be followed by a period of release, decommissioning. Why? Because the Bible never gave it the same status that it gave to Shiloh. And if Shiloh's destruction meant, or decommissioning meant, that regional altars were open again, then certainly Jerusalem, which isn't even mentioned in the Bible, once the temple there is decommissioned, it could be, regional sacrifices could be opened up again too. So Rabbi Yishmael, I hope you see the bit of the method to my madness. I'm trying to expand a little bit between sources, the question of exclusivity, whether that site is, according to the Torah, fixed and unmovable and permanent, and not only that, but our only option. According to Rabbi Shimon, it is the only option. According to the Mishnah in Zvachim, it's also the only option, but there once was a time when temple sites could be decommissioned. It just doesn't apply to Jerusalem. Why? Because the Torah says Menucha and Nachala is Jerusalem, and the Torah gives it that sacred status forever. Rabbi Yishmael's view is the most crazy, because for him, Jerusalem isn't even mentioned in the Torah. Jerusalem is just where we decided to put the temple after we didn't have access to Shiloh for one reason or another. And since Jerusalem does not get a permanent sacred status in the Torah, once we don't have Jerusalem anymore, we could give that power of being a central place for Jewish gathering and sacrifice to somewhere else, or to many other places. We did it after Shiloh was decommissioned. So now that Jerusalem is decommissioned, or even if it's not decommissioned, we could give that power to other places. When there is no central site, then it's sort of fair game to do whatever you want to do, wherever you want to do it. Does everyone understand this? I'm seeing a bit of confused faces. Let's just review it again.
No.
What Rashi says. He's talking about Rabbi Ishmael's view. Both terms refer to Shiloh, which nonetheless has a permitted period of regional sacrifice that follows its dominance. This view holds that the initial sanctity of Jerusalem was sacred for its own time, but not forever after. And this view holds that even the sanctity of Jerusalem is followed by a period of release. He holds that the Torah only refers to Shiloh. In other words, the Torah states that there will come a time when the decentralized regime will cease. But when the central shrine is displaced, decentralized worship is potentially permitted again. He would say, if I was going to ask Rabbi Yishmael, is the temple's destruction evidence of God departing, God's presence departing from that place? He would say, no, we have, I'm agreeing with what we learned, the statement from Rabbi Joshua. It's a holy place. It'll be a holy place forever. That status was given it to forever. So let's not confuse the questions. Rabbi Joshua's statement stands. But on the question of, could we build another temple somewhere else and give it holy status? Rabbi Ishmael is the only one of the three sources who would say, I think he would say, yes, we did it before when Shiloh was decommissioned. We can do it again now. We could have another site. It doesn't have to be Tel Aviv. It could be, for example, maybe the Kotel complex. Maybe the Kotel complex should have some sort of special, exclusive, holy status. In a way, it already does. There are rituals, not sacrifices, but maybe some of you have seen the ritual of the blessing of the Birkat Kohanim, the blessing of the priests, that's offered there in the holidays, or if you've ever been to the Kotel, when there's just this massive gathering there, in a way, it has become for us the central shrine, a holy place, not because of any formal statement, but because the people are treating it as if it is the central focus of all of our worship, the central site of all of our worship activities. I don't know if that's the right word, but the central site of the most important site of our worship and our religious, let's say, our religious.
That's because we don't have access to the Temple Mount.
Right, I know. Rose said that's because we don't have access. That's right. But Rabbi Ishmael says you don't have access to the Temple Mount does not mean you should not try to make centralized worship efforts elsewhere. Because just like when we didn't have access to Shiloh anymore, we were able to keep things going by having other sites of, in those days, sacrificial altars. We should have holy places today, just like the temple, that operate in many different places, or perhaps one other place, who knows? But his point is, sites can be commissioned and sites can be decommissioned. It is not just the place that matters, but the status that we give it. If we say this will be a temple, this will be a sacred spot, we can do that. Yes. Yeah.
Do these rabbis, who you're referring to,
yeah,
are they aware of each other's sources?
Oh, sure. Right. It's very common that we'll have a disagreement like this in the Talmud about how we read that verse. Remember, the book of Deuteronomy, when it makes that, in that verse, is intentionally cryptic because it's foreshadowing. Deuteronomy is, what is the setting of Deuteronomy? It's Moses' last speech to the people before he dies. So we're still in the wilderness. We're a long time before there's going to be a temple. So Moses is foreshadowing. One day you'll get to the Menucha and the Nachalah, and when you get there, that place will have a claim on you. So we're talking a century later, at least, where the rabbis are trying to figure out, does that mean that Jerusalem, which is the city that Moses might be referring to, but we don't know if he's referring to it, does that mean that Jerusalem is and will be in the future the only place of God's rest? So according to Rabbi Ishmael, No, Torah doesn't even know from Jerusalem. That happened later. The Torah knew about Shiloh, but it didn't know about Jerusalem.
So where is Shiloh now? And what happened to the?
Shiloh, I can tell you where it is now, but for some reason, the site of Shiloh lost its magic. Now, we have hints in the Torah about why it lost its magic. It's in the story in the book of Samuel after Hannah prayed there, right? What was the punishment to Eli, the high priest, and his sons? You see, I think the way these sites used to be run, and the way historians think they used to be run, is there would be a temple, and there would be one guy in charge, the high priest of the temple. It was Eli, who was the head of the temple in Shiloh, or the shrine in Shiloh. And who would be after Eli? His kids would be the high priest. There were other priests, but the high priest was the boss. And since he mocked Hannah and her prayer, it says that the punishment was that, what was it? God's presence was removed from the place, or that his children died, or neither will any of his children. So the hint in the Bible is God cursed that place because of that story, that he died young, that his children were punished. He lost his power. So even though that's about him, he was the boss of the shrine. And one might presume that when he went down, Shiloh went down. The whole thing just collapsed. And everybody, for one reason or another, turned against that site. And it was weakened. It was no longer dominant anymore. In other words, regional other altars, which existed at that time, according to the Talmud, no regional altars existed at that time. I'm not sure that's true. But let's assume the Talmud is correct. Well, after the people saw what had happened to Shiloh, that it had become a corrupt place where people were mocked. Well, what do you do if you don't like what's going on in shul? And you don't like the rabbi, you don't like the people that are going there? You build another shul. So that's probably what happened. The people said, we don't like this place, and let's build other places. So there is no story I can point to in the Bible for when God says, I'm done with you, Shiloh. We don't observe Tisha B'Av for Shiloh. I don't know which day on the calendar is the day of fasting for the destruction of Shiloh. It doesn't exist. It was more of a presumably natural sequence of events. It became corrupt, and then other shrines became the preference. It gave way. And the rabbis say here, that was all right, because even according to Rabbi Ishmael, in Rashi's view, Shiloh was meant to be temporary. It was given a holy status. There's no question it had a holy status when it was dominant, but then God took it away. And Jerusalem, which, remember, was destroyed for our sins, was also taken away. And we could build another temple if we wanted to somewhere else.
Could that temple have to be within the land of Israel?
Not necessarily. There's no source that says it. Right? So the flexibility here at the end of this class, I hope I have widened for you. Now, unfortunately, Rabbi Ishmael's view is too radical. But you should still know that it's out there. And it doesn't make its way into the codes. but you need to be familiar with it. What happens in Jewish law, and all of my classes, I hope, are not just about the topic that we're talking about, but also about how does Jewish law develop and work, and what are the sensibilities that go into it. And I'm glad we spent the first part of this class talking about how law and theology are tremendously intertwined in Judaism. If you just want to be a simple student of the law, you open up some legal book and it says you're not allowed to walk on that site. But until you learn the history of why you're not allowed to walk on that site and what was it that led the rabbis in a certain time, in a certain place, to insist that a place retains its holy status, then you don't understand why we do the things we do. And I think that can apply to almost all the laws we observe in Judaism, right? Until you dig into it, everyone walks into shul saying, why do we do the things that we do? Well, you see that many of the things that we practice today actually have fascinating histories that teach us a lot about God and humanity and what it means to be tied to sacred space. How many wars today are fought over sacred space that we're not willing to part with, right? And it wouldn't be okay to just displace people and put them somewhere else because there's something there. Even though God created the whole world, the history of a people, the consciousness of a religion, in almost every faith I can think of, is tied to certain places. And to just leave them, what we're looking at now, to just leave those places is going to, I think, provoke, in every religion, fascinating debates and disagreements and discussions. More next week. Thank you very much, everyone.